there is a distinction we can draw between the self and the sense of self. And drawing that distinction, really being clear about how they are different, turns out to be absolutely essential. The self is fundamentally a belief, but the sense of self, as I will argue later on, is something functional. It is something that is needed in this conventional world, in our transactional relative reality. So let's start with the self. The self, interestingly, is never actually experienced. A lot of us just have this fundamental belief that we are a self. And that self, for most people, is believed to be located in the body. It is somehow imagined to be the thinker of thoughts, the doer of actions, the perceiver of perceptions. But this self is never actually experienced. It is only ever something we can imagine to be there, but never something that ever appears in our experience. And so this self then can be removed or transcended in some really final way. And what I mean by that is that we can conclusively recognize in our experience that no such separately existing stable entity is really there. And so when this is recognized, the self as a belief is really off the menu. It's really akin to dropping any other kind of belief you might have. You might believe that the earth is flat, but upon traveling around the globe, you might then recognize, oh, okay, the earth actually isn't flat. And so this flat earth belief is just off the menu, it's not relevant anymore. And so similarly, the self can really be seen through in this way, as just a belief. So that addresses the self. But what about the sense of self? Now, this is actually a really crucial point, and I would say it is very much related to this belief in an actually existing self. The sense of self is something that can show up in our experience almost on a continuum. We can have this very strong, acute sense of self, where we really feel like this trapped, localized entity existing within the body. And on the opposite side of this continuum, the sense of self can just be there in a very functional way. So what do I mean by that? I mean, for example, that when you look at the body, you can match the sensations which arise onto this experience of the body. When you look out into the world, there's this relative distance you perceive, and you judge this distance based on how far it is from your body. So there's this self-construct here, which is localized in your field of experience. And likewise, when you have thoughts, you don't feel like they are somehow being implanted by some alien entity. You feel like, relatively speaking, they are your thoughts. And you can furthermore distinguish them from sounds which are just appearing in consciousness as well. I can, for example, also think back about my past, and there is this relative sense that there is this body-mind which has persisted through this past and is now existing here. Again, there's a relative kind of flavor to this sense of self. Another example is the movement of the body. Moving my arm right now feels different from just having a muscle spasm and my arm just flying around. There's a different flavor to it. And this kind of different flavor could be described as a very rudimentary sense of self. So there's always this relative sense of identification going on. And this relative sense of self, this identification, is of course quite useful. And so that is not something we should get rid of or need to get rid of. And getting rid of that is actually quite dysfunctional. When I was working as a clinical neuropsychologist, I sometimes saw patients where this more relative identification with the body wasn't in place. They had, for example, this idea that their arm wasn't theirs, and others had the sense that their thoughts weren't their own. And in some cases, people had the sense that they were being controlled by an outside force. So the relative sense of self was disrupted in a very unhealthy way. And that's certainly not something we should aim towards. That's certainly not some kind of enlightened state. So you might then wonder, how can we move from this acute sense of self where we really feel it to be real and we really feel like this contracted entity to this just purely functional, rudimentary sense of self? The basic mechanism that is at the root of this acute, contracted sense of self is that of grasping, we could say. It is the sense that awareness collapses around a particular part of our experience. And the tighter this collapse feels, the more contracted it is, the more acute this felt sense of being a localized self will be. It co-arises with this grasping fixation. The more we fixate on a part of our experience, the more we will actually feel to be a separately existing entity. And so when a thought arises and awareness seems to latch onto that, there's this contraction around this thought. With that comes then the sense of being a located thinker. And when that is relaxed and there's a recognition of this pure openness of being, which is flowing and expressing itself as the thought, there is still this relative sense of self there, but it no longer feels as if we are this located, contracted entity here, thinking the thought. Like I said earlier, the thought then just has this relative flavor, this sense of self to it, but it isn't contracted around, and is therefore, subsequently, also not believed to be fundamentally true. So this is not something you have to believe. Just watch your own experience. See how and when this relative sense of self turns into this acute sense of being located and contracted. Very much approach it with a kind of curiosity, because what you can discover there is really quite fascinating.